Just before we start, maybe I could offer a few comments just to say that I think on the one hand, during the pandemic, we have science research evidence has been so at the forefront of the response to COVID-19. Science advice has never been in the public eye as much as it's been in the last couple of years. And of course, the remarkable work with the vaccines has made us all aware of the kind of power of science in these emergency contexts, in this emergency context. But yet, if you look at those countries with the most investment in relevant science relevant to COVID-19, and those with what seem to be on paper the strongest science advisory systems, they haven't necessarily been the countries that have fared the best during the pandemic. So a set of issues there, a set of questions which arise about the relationship between science advice mechanisms, how we make evidence impactful, which we'll have an opportunity to think about during this session. I'm going to hand over now to Alison Park. As I said, Alison is the interim executive chair of the Economic and Social Research Council, which funds IPPO. She took up that position in January 2021, and she joined ESRC as Director of Research in January 2019. I know ESRC has recently produced a new strategy, and I think this issue of making evidence impactful is at the core of that strategy. So very glad to have you with us, Alison, and I hope you're ready to speak now.
I am. Thank you very much, Joanna. And indeed, this is something that's very dear to all of our hearts within ESRC. Right, let me just share my screen so I can show you a few slides. Oops, hang on. I think I'll be better at this by now. Just bear with me one sec. Right, can everyone see?
Yes, I think that's good. You're not in, that's it, fantastic.
Am I in presenter mode now?
You are.
Great, okay, fantastic. So yes, I'm going to talk to you for about 10 minutes. Broadly, two parts to this. So firstly, just say a little bit about ESRC and the sort of drivers that we're aware of and that are shaping what we do in relation to policy and brokering activities. And then I will just talk a little bit about how brokering, and I'm defining that in a very wide sense, and perhaps we can come back to that, how that fits into ESRC's wider thinking about policy. So ESRC, for those of you who don't know us, we're one of 9 constituent parts of UKRI, UK Research and Innovation. We've recently updated our vision and our mission as a research council. I won't read them out, but you can see them on the left of the screen there. And the two key points that I draw out from those in relation to what we're here talking about today are firstly, really recognizing and trying to bring home the importance of social, behavioral and economic research in relation to most, if not all, of the national and global challenges that face us. And then secondly, and sort of leading on from that, the relevance of our work, meaning that we need to focus not only on the research that we fund, but on how that research interacts with those who might be able to benefit from that research. And that clearly includes within that orbit policymakers as well as other research users like practitioners. So that's the sort of the big picture context for this. To step back a few years to before the creation of UKRI, indeed, many of you will be aware of the review that was carried out by Sir Paul Nurse that partly shaped the creation of UKRI. And I've put a quote up here, really just to emphasize the importance that was being attached then to permeability within the system. So trying to create mutual knowledge and understanding, trying to break down unnecessary barriers between those who are producing research and those who could be using it to oversimplify. And so in that spirit, I think I would see brokers as being really crucial intermediaries who sit at that boundary between, in this instance, research and policy. So if we fast forward a few years, indeed till last week, which is when UKRI's strategy was published, that flags as one of 4 key principles of change that underpin UKRI's strategy: connectivity. And I'm putting this up here, I suppose, really to show how in keeping that is with some of the issues that we're going to be talking about, and how indeed it follows through from that emphasis in the original review of the research landscape by Sir Paul Nurse. So you can see language like connectivity, breaking down silos, catalyzing the flow of knowledge and skills, etc., etc. In terms of what that means for the social sciences, by way of context, Joanna's already flagged the fact that the pandemic exacerbated what was already quite considerable demand and appetite for social science research and social science insight. So I suspect many of you watching this may have seen this photograph before, or indeed been in the room, but this is a screenshot of an event at which Sir Patrick Vallance, in his capacity as the government's chief scientific advisor, was presenting some analysis of the areas of research interest that have been carried out, that have been produced at that time by different government departments, and breaking them down into different themes. The key point from that is that when you analyse those areas of research interest, there was a huge preponderance of social science within that. So many of the questions that government felt really keen appetite to know more about were fundamentally questions that can only really be answered by social science, or that required social science working in partnership with other disciplines. So there's a lot of demand there for insights from social science, and that's only got bigger. The second bullet point relates to the fact that increasingly we've been aware of the desire for sort of greater geographic specificity, and by that I mean trying to move beyond research that applies at a UK level to research that might apply, say, at the level of a devolved nation, or indeed at the level of a region or even a local authority. And that's another challenge that I think we've all been grappling with. Partly in response to that, we've then seen, and this is the third bullet, a sort of increase in supply from within the research community, and an increased focus on the importance of impact and knowledge exchange activity. I'm sure we can all think of universities who put significant amounts of funding and support into trying to do more in this space. And the end result, which is the final bullet, is a growing but quite a complicated landscape that crosses a number of different boundaries between policy in particular and research. And with some organisations, and I'll say a bit more about this later on, like ESRC, I think sitting in that space between the policy world and the actual research practice world. And I think that gives funders like ESRC a really critical role to play. Okay, so what are we doing about this as ESRC? What are our plans in light of this sort of context that I've just set out here? So this slide shows ESRC's strategy when it comes to policy engagement. And the key things that I draw out from this are that we're trying to look across the research ecosystem. We recognise that, as I said before, it's quite a busy one, quite a complicated one. And we're focusing on identifying challenges and interventions across 3 broad stakeholder groups: policy, research, and funders. And we're focusing our efforts and our funding on those where we can see that we're in a really good position to help address them. And that's particularly focusing on areas like knowledge, capacity, and opportunity. So, I mean, there's quite a lot in the slide, and I won't go through all of the detail here, but just to pull out a couple of points that I think hopefully illustrate that. So when it comes to the policy community, we're aiming to increase their understanding of and their access to collaboration opportunities with the researchers that we fund. When it comes to the research community, it's very much about us helping to grow capacity and capability and awareness, and provide resources to help with that kind of engagement work. And then finally, for the funder community, and by this I'm really thinking about both ESRC and ESRC as part of UKRI. Our main focus of interest at the moment has been, what can we do within our own organisation to build an effective policy-minded funding organisation? And I'll say a little bit more about what that might look like in practice later on. And then cut across, cut across all of that, I think we see brokering as being a really key component of our broader approach to promoting and enabling the permeability of ideas, the ideas that we fund, and people. And I'll give you a couple of examples now that I hope bring that to life. Okay, so the first set of activities that I think are really relevant in this space are what we rather dryly call thematic infrastructures. And there's some examples on the right of the slide here, and indeed IPPO, who are here to celebrate today, is one of them. So these are infrastructures that we have funded that often have a particular topic area, although in some cases like IPPO that can be very broad, where the focus is really on mobilizing existing knowledge rather than funding new research, although there might be new research carried out. It's very much about what do we know and how can we communicate that better to the people that we know need that information. The second example focuses on that role I mentioned earlier of ESRC as a broker. So I said before that we operate, I think, in this really useful space between academia and research and policy. And that gives us a really important role to play. So we can, for example, help build connections between different groups. We can build capability. We can help understand and articulate what it might be that policymakers really want and think about how that might connect through to research. And then obviously we can incentivize and reward research impact. And one example here that is sort of illustrated on the slide is what we call the COVID Actionable Insights Seminar Series. And this was something that we initiated in partnership with the government analysis and policy profession. And it basically focused on the enormous amount of research that we funded through the UKRI COVID call and making sure that we could bring key elements of that, of the researchers we were funding, face to face with the people who might be using that evidence. Really successful, quite wide reach into government, and seminars that were often attended by 300 plus attendees. So I think we're all really pleased with how that went and the role that we could play in it. Thirdly, brokering is obviously can be quite a specialist role, but it's really important that everybody in the research and development system understands their role and how they can play a part. And in that context, we felt it's very important to think about training and how we can help ensure some of the sort of permeability and flow of people as well as ideas. And to that end, we've just announced relatively recently, in collaboration with 11 partners from across Westminster and the devolved nation, the creation of a new cohort of policy fellows. So these will be people going typically from academia, working within government for a limited amount of time, helping government understand what academic research can bring to their research questions, and then crucially allowing those academics to go back into academia with a really good understanding of how government works. Fourthly, I mentioned the role of us as a funder, and what I would flag here is an internal program we've been running, firstly within ESRC, but soon to be across UKRI, called Think Policy. And that is basically a seminar series aimed at staff that really brings to life how policymakers make use of the research that we fund. So we actually have a first of our UKRI-wide series next Tuesday, I think it is, where we have Sir Patrick Balance and Sarah Sharples coming in to talk about their roles within the government research and development system. And then finally, I would simply flag that, as you're all very aware, what we're doing within ESRC is part of a much broader and complicated ecosystem. And we're very aware that within that, you have some people taking a sort of brokering role within government. And here you'd have examples like the Government Office for Science and the GSR. And then others who are operating in a different space. So for example, the University Policy Engagement Network, UPEN, operating within the universities and thinking about how they can support knowledge brokering. And I think all of those groups are going to be really critical in helping us make the most of the opportunity to ensure that we're carrying out research that really does make a difference. Thank you.
Alison, thank you so much for that. That was just a wonderful opening to this session, and just so interesting to hear about your thinking of ESRC as a broker and in the context of that broader ecosystem of policy stakeholders and other research funders and researchers. Really interesting, and as I said, a great start to this session. Thank you. Alison, we're going to come back to you at the end of the session for a 5-minute reflection on the contributions from others. But right now, I'd like to welcome our panelists, and I'm going to turn first to Ursula Gobel, who is Vice President, Stakeholder Engagement and Advancement of Society for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And we have set our panelists some questions to address, but they really are only guiding questions. And I think our panelists come from very different perspectives and angles on them. So they will deal with the questions which will appear in the chat from those different angles and perspectives. Ursula, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to join you. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm joining you from the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples here, where our offices are located. And so, yes, thank you for providing some guiding questions. Many of my remarks, in fact, will echo Alison's great presentation, as this work has been very central to our work at SSHRC, it's the acronym for the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, in ensuring that the investments in research and talent really benefit Canadian society, Canadians, and the world writ large. And so I'll go as quickly as I can through the 4 questions, and we'll certainly reiterate some of these points in the Q&A session perhaps later. So one of the first questions was, how do we best frame and shape evidence for policy? And it really echoes the real need for a diversity of groups, of scholars and policymakers, business leaders, community groups, is really being central to both shaping evidence, but as well as shaping policy. And so in our strong engagement with the government sector here and various departments, addressing policy really requires the synthesis of knowledge before we can put it into action. And so evidence, perspectives, different knowledge frameworks from different disciplines and communities and spheres of society really must be brought together to form a more complete picture of these complex issues. And so this intersectionality or interconnectedness has really been inherent, and we've seen that clearly in the context of the pandemic, that research insights certainly can inform evidence to the diversity of policy domains that are responsible for developing those policies. Environmental sustainability is a prime example, where we see, in fact, global multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral collaboration and knowledge mobilization efforts that are accelerating the shaping of policy, but also to address the impacts of climate change. I would add the principle of future-proofing lens in shaping policy. And I can speak to that later in the context of our initiative, Imagining Canada's Future, where we provide a bit of a focal point through horizon scanning and foresight methodology to bring together scholars and policymakers, community leaders, sector leaders, to really start addressing what this global challenge can be, and then how do we mobilize research knowledge to address these issues, but then also where do we understand where the gaps are and in fostering relationships at that time. There's a question in terms of what role that funders can play to make research more impactful. Alison certainly shared very, very important practices and elements there. We certainly at SSHRC have been identifying knowledge mobilization as a funding criteria in all our research grants applications for some time. We offer dedicated funding for knowledge mobilization and research collaboration in terms of our grants, from connection grants to a whole scaling of partnership grants. But we have dedicated efforts as well to communicate findings and policy implications to policy makers and the wider public. Our Imagining Canada's Future initiative, launched in 2014, has a very, very dedicated focus on that. I would say probably most critically, And we see our role as an enabler, a facilitator, a convener, is establishing and enabling those relationships and those networks to actually be created. And there's numerous ways that we facilitate that, from identifying research experts, convening roundtables, forums, workshops, creating new channels to build, to co-create, and to share that knowledge across those sectors. That is absolutely critical. Also developing relevant tools. We ensure that all of our knowledge synthesis grants holders produce evidence briefs that draw from the knowledge synthesis to identify policy implications and recommendations, as well as the knowledge gaps that are very, very accessible to the policy community. How do policy stakeholders best use and organize evidence and knowledge? I would say that our experience, certainly notably over the past few years, has illustrated a greater demand for research knowledge, particularly from the social sciences and humanities, similar to Alison's remarks, to support emerging policy priorities. Access to research experts, to knowledge synthesis are in very high demand. But there's a reciprocal benefit too, in the context as certainly certain policy departments have data that is not necessarily accessible to the research community, but those channels are opening up that data sharing, which is a significant asset to the research community. We just launched the 6th International Policy Ideas Challenge, which is organized with Global Affairs Canada. And here, Global Affairs Canada has come to us to say, we want to have access to emerging talent, to graduate students, to early career scholars, to help shape policy, but also where we can have access to talent. They're offering training, internships, fellowships, so a much deeper connection with the research community. And that's taken years to evolve through these relationships. The question of how COVID has taught, what has COVID taught us about how universities can connect research with policy? Again, I would say that responding to global challenges requires knowledge research drawn from a variety and a broad range of academic disciplines, reflecting that diversity of methodology, perspectives, knowledge systems, and again, recognizing the role of the social sciences and humanities. This speaks also to the policy community. Strong channels connected already between the policy community and health and the scientific health community, practically non-existent in early stages with the social sciences and humanities community. So universities can certainly play a role in fostering that interdisciplinary collaboration earlier on in a scholar's career. Also recognizing the value of collaboration, community engaged scholarship within academia. It's getting better, but there's still work there to do. It is not mutually exclusive. Scholars who've published in journals and academic journals, peer-reviewed journals, have also gone on to produce clearly knowledge synthesis and engagement with the policy community. So that has evolved, and I think that is really important. I would say that and this is true of many global challenges. Regrettably, COVID has really illustrated the lack in the use of evidence from past research to inform policy and practice. We see that in the context of misinformation, disinformation. And so I think there are more efforts that could be dedicated to strengthening the impact of research before it becomes emerging policy priority. And so that goes back to my thought about future-proofing. So I think I may have gone over my 4 minutes, but I'll close there as a summary to the 4 questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ursula. Really interesting, and of course a lot of synergy, I think, with the contribution from Alison earlier. Real emphasis on not only just pushing research out there, but on co-creation of understanding what the policy need is, of understanding that broader environment. As a means to making research more impactful. You also highlighted the need for diversity of knowledge, and you know, that's something Alison also touched on, that social sciences are clearly an important part of that diversity that hasn't always been evident during the pandemic, but in latter stages has been increasingly acknowledged as vital to being able to address the challenges of the pandemic. and really interesting comments you made on the synthesis of the need to synthesize knowledge and that diverse knowledge and future-proofing. So thank you. Look forward to coming back to you during the Q&A. We are going to now hear from Simon Brindle, who is head of policy profession in the Welsh Government and director of COVID recovery and restart. So Simon, you may come at these issues from a slightly different angle. I can't see you on my screen, but I think you're with us.
I'm here, thank you.
Great, welcome.
Thank you. Similar comments as you might expect, but possibly a different perspective. If I had to summarize this question in 3 words, I'd say relevant, timely, and digestible are the things that are needed to make evidence impactful. And I can come at that in sort of 2 different ways, from kind of thoughts about the experts, evidence providers, policy community, then what can we do about it? In terms of what experts can do to actually make their evidence most impactful, I think need to understand the limitations of the evidence, particularly in the sense of COVID. There's a whole set of issues around uncertainty. Recognize decisions were being taken on issues where we didn't have a full evidence base. We had to understand the implications of acting without full knowledge. The time lags that come on things like a non-pharmaceutical intervention and how that's actually going to affect. We were kind of having to do this on the fly. So understanding the time lags on something as fast moving as COVID. And a third issue for experts is actually the range of interpretation of what the evidence tells you. I think academics should always be ready to answer the question, what would someone else say? Are you representing, you're not just representing your own personal interpretation of the evidence, you're representing the expert community. So actually, if there is a divergent set of views, it's almost a responsibility of yourself to actually be able to put that into the policymaking system. And there is a danger for experts when interfacing with policy, which is to stray away from their level of expertise. The topics that we were dealing with around COVID particularly meant that everybody had a personal interest. And to always remember that actually, when you're talking about the evidence, when you're talking about your evidence base, or when you're straying into your own personal opinions, those are quite challenging things. But on the policy side, it's equally challenging because I think needing policymakers, policy advisors to be able to ask the right questions, to understand the evidence when they get it, and understand its implications. And I think to understand all of the perspectives of and limitations of where the evidence is and how to best to get those interactions with experts to interpret policy. So what can we do about it? Building on lots of the things that Alison was talking about there, that boosting that kind of policy research interchange. So really glad to be hosting a policy fellow who started last month. I think there's an issue about infrastructure. So putting in place capacity that actually you can have that relevant, timely, digestible evidence coming through. So in Wales, very glad to be partnering with ESRC to have the Wales Centre for Public Policy, which connects in with the UK-wide What Works centre networks. And I think that is a great initiative which actually synthesizes a huge amount of evidence in policy digestible format. So that's absolutely vital. And I think there's an issue in policymaking to see evidence as a governance issue and a budget issue. That actually, if you're going to invest money or make decisions, really ought to be thinking about actually how sound is this decision? How can you get out of it if it proves out to be wrong? And I think there's something about there, and in Welsh Government, we're strengthening our systems around that both putting in place an evidence board, but also upping the quality and consistency of evaluation. And I think when you're dealing with levels of uncertainty, you have to kind of build on the techniques and tools around innovation to actually try things, evaluate them quickly, and actually identify the ones which are useful to build on. So I think in 3 words again, that's relevance, timeliness, and digestibility.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, those 3 words are, we have those embedded in our consciousness in IPPO. We try to work closely with that guidance that you've given us in mind. Also really interesting to hear your thoughts on how researchers engage as sort of representatives of bodies of knowledge, not just as individuals when they're entering into this space of trying to inform policy with the evidence that they're producing. Really interesting, thank you. We're now going to go on to hear from Professor Annette Boaz, who's Professor of Health and Social Care Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Alison mentioned in her intervention the ARI, the Areas of Research Interest Initiative, and Annette is an ARI policy fellow, I think is the title. Annette, you'll tell us, and welcome. I think you're there, even though I can't see.
I am. Thanks, Jo. As Jo said, my work, my academic work has always been on the interaction between evidence, policy and practice, but I'm currently a fellow putting that into practice as an intermediary myself. So that's what I'm going to draw on today. Again, I very much agree with everything that's been said so far. It's remarkably consistent with the notes I'd made for this session. I think the first question around how we frame evidence for policy puts a real challenge out to us as different stakeholders in the system about how we mobilize multidisciplinary contributions, because what we know from the work we've done on government areas of research interests, so those are identified by all government departments, is that there's loads of crossover between departments, and also the things people are interested in are inherently draw from different disciplines and different bodies of knowledge. So, but that isn't easy work to do, reconciling and bringing together those different pieces of evidence. And so, as Ursula said, there's work to be done to help with that. I think also to flag up, I guess government is often drawn to looking for effective interventions and looking for evaluation, but also there's so much to be useful and usable from history, ethics, implementation, science, anthropology, to help with the challenges of policy making and how we make sure that those different types of evidence, as well as kind of different disciplines, are all brought together to help with those difficult questions. I think that's the real challenge for me. And then alongside that, how we bring different stakeholder perspectives in to help us think about evidence for policy. We've been thinking a lot in our fellowships about the role of funders. And I think, as Alison identified, it is a real pillar for the work in terms of supporting the use of evidence in policy, the kind of really the potential role funders can play in this work. But I think what we see in the UK is a very varied kind of funder perspective on what their role is in that system. So not all funders describe themselves as kind of brokers. Not all of them see a role in kind of mobilizing evidence as kind of something to really invest heavily in. So I think this is a challenge to make sure that this becomes part of the kind of funder landscape more generally. And there is a international network now of funders who are interested in coming together to think about evidence mobilization. And that feels to me like a really positive network and contribution. So that kind of mobilizing role, and also curating the portfolio. So how accessible is a funder's portfolio when policymakers have questions to ask? And there's a quite a big kind of job to be done there to make sure that that portfolio is accessible, because critically, we really want to make use of the research we have already, rather than constantly go out to get new research done. So that feels like a real challenge. And I guess the final thing I want to say about funders is the potential of funders to provide disincentives for doing this kind of work. The one I've been thinking about most recently is how it can be so hard to bring on board your non-academic partners as co-applicants even at the proposal stage of the research process. So do the other bits of the structure, systems and processes of funders also work with the kind of intent to build a kind of more of a kind of mobilizing role for funders. In terms of policy stakeholders, for me, moving into a kind of role within the UK government, I have been really impressed actually by the kind of amount of structure and process that's in place to support evidence use, particularly in terms of leadership, coordination, capacity building for staff, the kind of analytical profession. What we hear a lot in our conversations is people wanting support with the academic policy engagement. So how do they kind of reach out and connect? And also, where can we have safe spaces to have dialogue between the academic policy community around sort of translating evidence, moving it from written research to something that can be used to tackle policy priorities. So that feels like a bit of a challenge, how we create those safe spaces where researchers and policymakers can talk about the kind of problems faced by policy and to think about how research can help with that. And I absolutely agree with Simon that the critical part of that is academics speaking for a body of knowledge, not for their kind of individual pieces of work. And I guess finally on that one, I had just to echo the role of some of this movement between different environments. So we're thinking a lot at the moment about moving academics into policy and practice environments, but also some scope for people to move out of government and spend time in kind of policy in practice and in academic environments, so that we're all understanding a bit better about each other's worlds. And one of the things that policymakers who've done that kind of work often are surprised by, for example, is just that understanding what the academic year looks like and how that makes a difference for when you might ask things of academics. And then just on the final point about thinking about the sort of, I guess, that last challenge, we've already talked through, I think, the sort of role, the opportunity and some of the aspects of that I was thinking about. The sort of thing I think is a little challenging about what's happened in the pandemic, it's a kind of raising up of individual academics, a sort of celebrity academics culture, which I think undermines the idea of kind of research as something that's produced by teams collaboratively and a wider view of teams now to involve other stakeholders. And so I would really hope that as we move forward, we can put back out there the idea that we produce science and social science together with our academic colleagues and with our networks, and it's a collective endeavour, and it's not something that sort of single people have done all by themselves. That was never the case, but I think it's been a little bit reinforced over the last couple of years. I was going to stop there, Joe. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Annette. That's so interesting. That last point about the importance of teams, and of course I couldn't agree more. And IPPO is an example of that. It's not it's very much teamwork, as is often the case, partly because of the challenges, as you indicated earlier, of trying to bring together different bodies of knowledge. Highly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary teams are needed to do that. I think there are lots of questions. The importance of knowledge synthesis is really coming through, as is the importance of living in each other's realities as researchers and policy stakeholders. Those themes have been mentioned by all of our speakers so far. I'm going to move on now to Professor Dominique Brozzard, who's a member of the Sean Executive Committee. And Sean is the Societal Experts Action Network, which facilitates rapid and actionable response to social, behavioural and economic related COVID-19 challenges. Dominique she's a member of the Sean's Executive Committee and chair of the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin. I think I can't see you, Dominique. I think you're with us, and
I'm there, thank you.
Welcome to the discussion.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm going to keep my remarks brief because all the panelists have actually raised most of the points I wanted to raise, but I will focus mainly on the question of what has COVID taught us about how university can connect research and policy, growing on that experience that I had with that network in the United States. So the interesting thing about Sean that Joanna mentioned is it really came out as an initiative pushed forward by two funders, the National Science Foundation and the Sloan Foundation. National Science Foundation in the United States is the main body that funds basic and applied research, mainly basic research. So really, two individuals, literally, within those, which is kind of sad that is part of an individual to push this kind of initiatives, that realize that as far as socioeconomic and behavioral sciences, there's a lot we know that could be useful in terms of making policy decision in the context of a pandemic or other topical issues, but that knowledge is not accessible to the policymakers. So the way that was created at the beginning of the pandemic was to have like a network of associations of governors and so on, the cities, the district, the mayors, in connection to our network, for them to actually ask questions. And they were very, very applied. Like, what can we do to actually make sure people do practice social distancing? How can we, have persuasive message to make people wear masks? And so what we did is, with those rapid expert consultations, is literally go around the nation and the world, find the best expert and ask them to very quickly write a synthesis of the research as far as like, what can we use as far as the knowledge that we already know that can be translated in practical actions. It worked really well, by the way. I mean, everybody tells me, well, we had close to 900,000 deaths in the United States, but I reply, maybe if we hadn't done anything, we would have much more. So, and the vaccines, adoption is not been as quick as we want, but is still being quite successful. So the question is, how can we make this kind of thing not just an answer to a crisis, but something more, let's say, not a transitional thing, but something that would stay and be lively moving forward. The problem is, like, we don't have the structure to do so, because it goes to your question about what has COVID taught us about how university can connect research with policy. In normal times, researchers do their research, and in the United States, they try to publish to get tenure and to go with their life. They don't have the time and incentive to actually quickly answer questions that they may be put forward in front of them to answer, like a policymaker demand. So the question is, what he has taught, I think, is that we need to actually revisit the way we incentivize researchers to be part of this enterprise. And again, building on what the other panelists have said, as far as teamwork, as far as like quickly and timely, as far as like not reinventing the wheel, and certainly staying within their own expertise. Because Simon did mention that one of the problems was also that, the attraction of being cited in the media and so on, produced some people that, were talking about things that were out of their realm of expertise. That's one problem. The second problem that he has taught us is, and I think Simon is the one who mentioned that, is that we always knew that science tend to be portrayed as more certain as it is, right? Science is incremental by nature, knowledge is produced and then, replicated and made more precise and so on. And in terms of the pandemic, we knew we were in a post-normal type of scientific enterprise as knowledge was produced as we were moving along. And I think this is something, going back to the university, that we need to teach our researchers to talk about their science in a way that really does not, emphasize certainty when certainty is not there. And certainly in the United States, this has been a problem. It's always been a problem that, we have a media portraying our science as much more certain than it is, but certainly in terms of during the pandemic, it was even worse. So I think we do need to have some kind of, thought process in teaching people how to talk about their science. And it sounds very basic, but unfortunately, that's the thing. The third thing that I would like to say is that we need to remember that science can be also used in terms of using policy as a tool for partisanship. I mean, the pandemic in the United States happened at the time of one of the most contested presidential election in the history of this country, with President Trump rerunning and so on. And slowly but surely, scientific research began to be perceived as partisan, like being equated with the Democrats and the left versus the right and so on. And we all know that science is political, right? Policy decision of funding and so on. But certainly science cannot be partisan. And I think it really taught us that there needs to be a careful thought process about how science can be used as a tool to push some political agenda in a way that doesn't deserve it to the scientific enterprise. So I put some ideas out there that I hope will generate discussion, but thanks for the opportunity for being here.
Thank you, Dominique. Yes, I think you've given us plenty to think about there. Really interesting. Science as part of the political process. Yes, we've seen that happen in such interesting ways during the pandemic. But you also raise questions about what it means for researchers to do this work and the importance of a kind of cultural shift in the academic community. If we're really going to take on board what it takes to make research have impact on policy, we need to train ourselves as researchers to do things a bit differently. I'd love to come back and talk more about that kind of question and response model that you set up in Sean. Maybe we'll have a chance to do that in the Q&A a bit more. Thank you. I'm going to go on to our final panel member, last but certainly not least, Professor Erika Kraemer Mbula, who's Professor of Economics at the University of Johannesburg. Erika is a Newton-funded trilateral chair of a Transformative Innovation Initiative, and looking forward to hearing your perspectives on these questions, Erika.
Thanks so much, Jo, and very pleased to be here. This is a fascinating discussion. I'll try to be very quick to leave some time for the Q&A. So also one of the advantages of being last is that a lot of what I had to say, similar to the previous speaker, has also been covered, and there's a lot of consensus as well. But I would like to contribute to this discussion from my experience in South Africa, and I will focus on primarily the first question: how can we best frame and shape evidence for policy? And perhaps I'll touch a little bit on question 4 as well. So as it was the case in other parts of the world, in South Africa, policymakers were confronted with multiple knowledge gaps as they battled to craft some responses to the changing needs of the pandemic. So scientists in all fields were called to provide synthesis and evidence and facts, and to be part of all of these various committees, often with very specific objectives. The discussions between scientists and the policy community became quite fluid at some point, and I think the urgency and the need pushed both sides to sort of find the middle ground and make sure that they understood each other. And I think this has had some lasting changes in both the appetite for better communication channels between science and policy, but also a broader range of communication channels. But I think, and this is the point that I want to bring on, is that our problems, and I think the pandemic has made it quite evident, are at the system level. So we have economic, policy, social, and even science systems that can produce and reproduce inequalities, social and environmental problems. So part of the solution implies that we must be prepared to making changes to the dysfunctional parts of the system itself. So I believe that we won't get the magnitude of the change that we need in order to build a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable future through improved communication alone. I think we need to move to a space of co-creation, which has been emphasized by other speakers. And I will talk a little bit about the example of in our chair and how we're doing that. So our chair is about transformative innovation, as it was mentioned by Joanna. Transformation we understand as this drastic shift towards low carbon and more inclusive economies and societies. So we understand that changes at the system level require the engagement of policy makers, but also new ways of doing policy and also new ways of doing science. So as one of the activities in our chair, we are supporting a policy experimentation lab. And I think the pandemic has raised an appetite for policy experimentation, which has also been mentioned by others, and for trying new ways. So this lab is conceptualized to experiment with new policy approaches in co-creation with policymakers. At the core is this process of co-learning, reflection, bottom-up participatory engagement between teams of academics, policymakers, and practitioners. Co-creation is easier said than done, and blending different types of interests and languages and even ways of thinking, it's quite difficult. We involve our students in and emerging researchers in this lab, so they contribute to building new narratives, practices, and networks of policy experimentation as part of the research. Policymakers engage in defining the research questions. They receive expert academic input and advice, but also build their own capacity through the process of engagement. So these engaged policy experiments are the primary mechanism for creating the kinds of desired change, but they can be not accept. Policy experimentation may not be accepted at first and may operate in a niche, so it can find resistance when policymakers try to do things in a different way. So part of our efforts are also in building a broader community of practice that thinks about transformative innovation policy, presenting these ideas to a broader set of stakeholders, so they value these perspectives and tools. So they sort of understand the attention that needs to be paid to the changes at the system level. So it's about building broader acceptance as well as building new ways of doing science and policy. So I think this is perhaps not the only solution, but an important ingredient for the way forward. Let me stop here.
Erika, that was just great. Thank you. And so interesting to hear about that kind of policy experimentation approach and the importance of kind of co-creating between, an effort between researchers and policy stakeholders to co-create new ways of doing things and to translate evidence into policy advice and practice. I've been a very bad chair. We have very little time for questions, which is a shame because there are some really interesting questions in the chat. From JD, how do we evaluate the effectiveness of research work as it affects various stakeholders? So coming back to a point that Simon made very clearly, that the evaluation of advice given, of the effectiveness of research is vital, and the ability to turn things around when things are not working is really important. Other comments about the importance of mobilizers, brokers, and working together across universities and funders being made. Annette mentioning an effort, a space for learning across communities called Transforming Evidence, which Annette's given the link in the chat there. And someone making the point that the evidence of, Chris Bundy making the point that the evidence, that the issue of high profile academics, we shouldn't overstate it because there are some great examples of good teamwork out there and people doing things in a more collaborative way, which I'd also agree with. I am going to hand back over to Alison for some concluding remarks. And yes, that'll take us up, I think, to the hour. Alison.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna. And thank you so much to the panel. That was really, really stimulating. And I'm not going to even try and do it justice in my 4 minutes, but I just wanted to pick out a couple of things that really resonated with me and that I think are going to be very important for us in thinking about ESRC and what we can do in the future. So the first one was I really liked Simon's relevant, timely, digestible, just as a kind of 3 words to really think about the relevance of to this challenge. And I was struck in particular by the comment that Annette made about how we really need to focus on existing bodies of work as well as new bodies of work, because that's a critical way of making our what we're doing timely. If we're having to wait for new research, it's not going to be very timely. So I think there is a challenge there about how we marshal the existing evidence that we already have. And that's very relevant to some of the funding we've given recently to observatories like IPPO and indeed the Economics Observatory. The other point I'd pull out as relevant to that sort of relevant, timely, digestible 3 words was, Erika, your point about co-creation as being absolutely critical to the relevance point. We're aware that we can fund the most relevant research if there is a degree of co-creation, or if that's not possible, that early conversation and discussion with the key research users, that seems really vital. And then the final 2 points I wanted to flag were, Ursula, I really liked your point about how one of the perhaps unanticipated consequences of that deeper connection between the research and policy world was to really help facilitate access to data. And that has been a really huge part of our thinking within UKRI when it comes to accessing government administrative data. And a key part of that is indeed about how do you break down the barriers of understanding about what researchers can and can't do with data sets like that. And then the final one to flag, and not to leave Dominique out, is Dominique, your point about this all being part of a broader research ecosystem and acknowledging the role that universities have to play in what they incentivize amongst the staff that they employ. And that's quite a sort of live issue for us within UKRI more generally. And I would, those of you who aren't aware of it, there's a lot of thought going on at the moment about something called the resume for research, which is a new way of trying to help researchers bring across the breadth of what they've contributed apart from writing peer-reviewed journal articles and bringing in you know, X number of different grants. So thank you, everybody. Really, really stimulating conversation that I really enjoyed listening to. Thank you. And thank you to IPPO and Joanna for organising this.
Well, thank you, Alison, and thank you all. That was a really interesting session, and I'm sorry we didn't have more time for Q&A, but there will be other opportunities, I'm sure, to follow up. Thank you all. Bye-bye.